First, let me just say thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you all for being here.
I appreciate it. I've read a couple of things, as you know, because you shared them with me, that you wrote about your career and your life and about your experience as a client. And one of the things that caught my eye as I read your reflections on your own career was this. This was about your decision to go to law school. So you wrote, "My decision to go to law school was not particularly well informed. I did not personally know any lawyers, nor did I have a clear picture of what lawyers did or what it would be like to be a lawyer." Now, you've been a lawyer and a law teacher and administrator and dean. It's been 30 years since you graduated, more than 30 years since you graduated from law school. Today, as we sit here for the second time, you're the dean of this law school. How did you get from that person who didn't know any lawyers and didn't know what they did to where you sit today?
Well, it's not been a straight path, I'll tell you that. It's interesting to hear that quoted back to me because it makes me sound a little stupid maybe, but at the time that I decided to go to law school, I think I went to law school for the reasons that I think a lot of people go to law school. I had a yearning to do something with my life that mattered, and I had a sense that being a lawyer mattered. I knew that lawyers use their skills in a variety of ways to make a difference in the world, and so I think I had some sense of wanting to do that. I thought I would enjoy the intellectual part of being a lawyer, the kind of good student part of being a lawyer appealed to me, at least at the beginning it appealed to me. But I think I've gotten here today by being maybe open to things as they appeared on the horizon, trying to learn from every twist and turn of the career, trying to learn about myself, what I enjoyed about those moments in my life, what I didn't enjoy, where my strengths and weaknesses were, and being open to that. When I went to law school, I did not particularly enjoy my first year of law school, and I almost dropped out. And ironically, what I wanted to do instead was to go get a PhD in political science because I thought I wanted to be a college teacher. It did not occur to me while I was in law school that there might be a career path as a legal educator for me. I don't know why it didn't, but that was just not something that had presented itself. And so I think always I kind of had this yearning to teach, but I also was attracted to the law. So in retrospect, maybe it's not so surprising that I ended up with a career in legal education.
When you say you didn't like law school, what was it that you didn't like, and how did you overcome that?
I think that I struggled with the same thing many first-year students struggle with, which is I had a hard time knowing what I was supposed to be doing. And so that was uncomfortable for me as a first-year law student. I think the competition was something that I'm not somebody who really thrives on conflict, and I understand that about myself now, but I think that was a hard adjustment for me. And so I think those were a couple of things, and then maybe some of the things that we've talked about in class, the focus on the cognitive to the exclusion of other matters was something that caused some dissonance for me that I didn't recognize at the time, but in retrospect, I think that was part of it.
Well, when you graduated, you went into practice with what at that time was a big law firm.
Right.
It's now a much bigger.
Yeah, it was 90 lawyers then. That was a huge law firm in 1980. Yeah.
And you've written in these pieces that you shared with me that you were dissatisfied with that experience as you were having it, and with the passage of time and the perspective of time, you have a better understanding as to why. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think again it was because it was maybe something that I was not fully prepared for. It was not anything about the environment. The people I worked with were excellent lawyers. They were good people. They were supportive. So part of it, I think, was whether I was ready for that kind of practice at that moment in my life. Again, it was a practice that was a lot like the continuation of law school, because at that time, first-year associates primarily engaged in research and writing. We did a little bit of You know, I took some depositions and I did a few things like that, but it was, again, very much sort of an academic approach to the practice of law. But I think it was probably because I was not really prepared for what it meant to be a lawyer, and so I was still struggling to meet what I felt were unclear expectations. The other thing I think goes back to this notion of conflict, and that was I really wanted to do litigation. I chose to do litigation. I was assigned to both the litigation and the antitrust departments. But what I've learned about myself is I don't really enjoy conflict for the sake of conflict. And so that was a mismatch for me that I didn't recognize at the time. The other thing was that in that firm of 92, I think, lawyers, there were 7 women. The firm had had one woman partner in its history. She had since left to go on the federal bench. And so that was a new world for the law firm and a new world for the women who were trying to break some of those barriers and adjust. So that was different too in terms of working out what the expectations were that all of us had around that change at that time.
Well, you know, as you think about life as a woman in a big law firm at that time, there came a time in your early in your career you found out you were going to have your first child.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you wouldn't mind sharing with the students what the law firm's reaction was to that.
Yeah, well, the law firm had adopted a maternity leave policy that was quite advanced for its time, and they were very proud of it. And I think that was in part because the woman partner had, after becoming partner, had her first child, and at the time she had moved the firm towards a maternity leave policy. And so as part of their recruiting now of young women lawyers, they had invoked the availability of this policy, but I think in reality there were 3 of us who within several months of each other announced our pregnancies, and when the reality happened that now it was time to implement the maternity leave policy, again, that was new for them. In terms of the 3 women associates, it was new for us to be lawyers and mothers. We hadn't experienced that before. As an entity, I think the firm worked to be welcoming. I think because it was such an adjustment, there were some individual lawyers in the firm who didn't know how to deal with it. And the way that that got communicated to me was that my decision to get pregnant at that point in my career was seen as a lack of commitment to the firm and its work. And so that was a hard thing for me to deal with. I don't want to say that that was a uniform reaction, but that was a reaction of one of my immediate supervisors. And it did lead to a difficult conversation with him at the time that I was going out on maternity leave. That was very painful because he pretty much told me, I think you've set back your career enormously at this point. So that was tough.
Well, you made a career change.
I did, yes.
Yeah.
I decided not to go back to the firm. Yeah, after my daughter was born.
And went back to the University of Georgia.
I did.
You started as a legal writing tell me exactly what your capacity was.
Yeah. I started teaching legal writing, which at that time at the University of Georgia, I think it still is perhaps, not a tenure track position. So it was a staff position as an instructor. I did become director of the legal writing program pretty soon after I started. I don't remember whether that was in the first year or not. But that was my introduction to being a legal educator. And along this theme of maybe not having my career very well plotted out, that job came about because after the birth of our daughter, we went back to Athens where my father-in-law was a minister to have her baptized, and the dean of the law school was a member of that church. And so after church, he came up to my husband and me and he said, you know what, we've got a couple of openings at the law school that I think you all would be really well suited for. We had not really thought about that, and at that point we did make a change. We were both in large firms in Atlanta. My husband then became the assistant director of their legal aid clinic, and I went to teach legal writing. So that was really how our career paths changed, and we got started in legal education, which we both loved teaching. So that was a good move for us, but you know, it was not a planned move, actually.
Well, and that's what I wanted to ask you about, because you know, I know as these first year students, they hear advice from older lawyers, and sometimes that advice is, you know, plan everything, right?
Yeah.
Plan your career, decide what you're going to do, and go for it. And your career has not been like that.
No, it really hasn't been like that. No.
I mean, from one move to another, it has been serendipity, fortuity, but also seizing of opportunities as
Yeah.
they came along.
Yeah.
You've been teaching ever since.
Yeah.
What is it you like about that?
That's a good question. There's a lot that I like about it. One of the things that I like about teaching in a law school is you still have one foot in the profession and one foot in academia. So I think that's good, because while I did not practice law for a very long time, I really do love lawyers and I love the profession. And so it's been fun to be able to teach in a setting that keeps me connected to the profession for all the things that drew me into the profession in the first place. But of course, the best thing about teaching are the students. I mean, that's, you guys come in with new energy every year, every day. Being able to watch students at the beginning of their careers and then follow them throughout their careers. I've been doing this now over 30 years, so I've got a lot of former students whose careers have taken various twists and turns that I'm still in touch with. Getting to watch them has been really exciting. There's an intellectual challenge to teaching. There's a piece of connecting to people around teaching that I find satisfying. So, all of those things I've found really gratifying for years.
Well, as they say back in my home, in your adopted home, Texas, you're preaching to the choir.
Yeah.
But you chose eventually to become first associate dean at Texas Tech, and then, goodness gracious, dean of a law school.
Yeah.
And that's a totally different job.
It is.
It's not just a progression from professor, it's a totally different job.
Yeah.
Why, and what did you like about that?
Well, again, the associate dean opportunity came because of a dean at my law school in Texas who asked me to serve that role. It was, again, not something that I really had sought out. I had moved from being a legal writing teacher at the University of Georgia to then we had moved to Texas, and actually my husband got the job in Texas first as a tenure track member of the faculty, and then I was hired. So that was a change from one kind of teaching position to another kind of teaching position. I say all that by way of explaining that I was still fairly early in developing that tenure track career and had not really thought about going into administration. The dean came to me, told me he thought I was well suited for this role. He wanted me to consider accepting the role. I did, and ended up serving almost 8 years as associate dean for academic affairs. And during that time, I learned that there were a lot of things about administration that I liked. Now, interestingly, because I'd been director of a legal writing program earlier, I had begun to see some of those things about what I liked in that position. And then when I became associate dean, I saw some of those things again. I liked the idea of having the big picture about curriculum, about pedagogy, about the institution. I like the idea of thinking about how you move an institution from where it is to where it wants to be. I liked the problem-solving challenges of having a building of highly educated, very smart, very vocal, very good advocates that you're working with all of the time. That presents both opportunity and challenge, and I enjoyed that. I enjoyed the connections with the university that happen when you're in that kind of administrative role, so that you get to see where the law school fits in more broadly with the rest of the university. So of course that sort of planted the seed for me to think about becoming a dean. And then at the time that our youngest child graduated from high school, it seemed a time when we might be ready to make a move. And that's the time when I decided to apply to several schools to become dean, and fortunately ended up at Mercer.
Well, I'll note for the record that my greatest contribution to the history of Mercer Law School is that I made the call.
You did make the call.
I made the
It's
initial
true.
phone call
It's
at the
true.
urging of Jack
Yep.
Sammons.
Yeah, it's true. I can, in fact, I can picture where I was standing in my kitchen in our home in Lubbock, Texas, when Professor Longan called to talk to me about this job. Yeah. And here we are, almost exactly 10 years later. Yeah.
One of the things that I know the students are curious about is how you manage to do everything you do and still have a happy home life and raise two wonderful children. And how do you balance all of that? Is there a secret formula? If so, please tell us.
I don't think there's a secret formula, and I don't know that I've always done it well. I feel grateful to have been able to have a career where I feel like I didn't have to sacrifice my career to do what I wanted to do to be a good parent, and I don't think I had to sacrifice being a good parent for the benefit of my career, and so I've been very fortunate about that. My first piece of advice is choose carefully whom you marry, because that's very important. And I had the good fortune to marry somebody who's been an equal partner in both of those aspects of my life all along. So that, I feel really fortunate about that. We grew into that. We married right before we started law school, and so, we began our married lives with that sort of equal emphasis on career, and then we've carried that over. So I've been fortunate there. I think the thing about balancing family and career is to try to be in a situation where you have some control over your schedule. And as professionals, we're able to do that, and that's a privilege. It carries responsibility with it, but the ability to juggle happens in large part because you're in a situation where you can choose to leave the office at 3 o'clock and go to an after-school event, even if it means you're working after dinner or you're getting up very early the next morning or that sort of thing. And so we've been able, I think, to blend pretty successfully our personal and our professional lives. I wouldn't hold us up every day as models, but I think on balance we're pretty satisfied with what we've been able to do.
I want to shift gears now.
Okay.
Because there came a time when you found yourself in need of a lawyer, and that is a traumatic event in the life of people that find themselves there. Could you tell the students a little bit about what happened to lead to that? Then I want to talk to you about your experience with your particular lawyer.
Okay. Yeah, I'll be glad to share that experience. I don't want to get into the detail. It's a very long story. And the details don't matter too much, but I do want to give you enough of that story so that you'll have a sense of how it felt to be in that situation and to need a lawyer, and so that you can understand the role that my lawyer played. I was at my former institution. I had been serving as associate dean for probably 5, 6, maybe 7 years, anyway, quite a while. I'd been in the associate dean role there. Had been very active in the community there, been active in the university. I was fully tenured on the law faculty. And our dean announced that he was leaving to go take a different position, and we were beginning the process to engage in a dean search for the law school. I was asked to serve on the dean search committee, which is pretty normal for the associate dean, and about 3 weeks after that process began, the dean of the law school came back from a meeting with the president of the university very upset and told me that during that conversation, the president of the university had indicated that he would not be open to appointing a woman as the next dean of the law school. And that's troubling for all the reasons that you all will understand that it's troubling on many levels, but it was also troubling to me as a member of the search committee, having knowledge that I thought that this was going to be a search that was going to involve illegalities, discrimination, unfairness, and I had to decide what to do with that piece of information.
May I add one little piece to
Yeah.
this, and that is that as the long-term associate dean, it would be almost natural, not inevitable, but almost natural, that you would step into the interim dean role.
Yeah.
And so, although I know that's not a job you were seeking, the president's statement that no woman will be the dean, and I know he didn't say it that way, but that was the import of it. He said it in a much more vulgar way. That no woman will be, really had a direct impact on you.
Well, it did, and in fact, I had decided I was not going to seek the deanship there. There were reasons that I didn't think that would be a good match for me or for the institution, but I actually had asked to be considered for the interim dean position, and there is a piece of this, it ends up being a little bit of a tangential piece, but there was a piece of this that had to do with that interim dean process. So it did feel quite personal in a number of ways, because certainly that comment I thought reflected on my own position within the university as well as that of all women within the university, and also as a member of the search committee. Not only did we want the search to be fair, but I already had been charged with recruiting a couple of very high-profile women lawyers in the state. to enter the search. And so to do that at a time when I knew that really there was intent at the top not to appoint a woman. The president denies making that comment. I need to say facts are disputed, but I was convinced that it was a very credible story and a credible threat to the search process at the time.
What happened next?
What happened next was that I decided to seek the advice of someone in the university administration who was in the provost office, the senior woman in the university, and someone with whom I had dealt pretty closely over the years. That quickly took a nasty turn because within about an hour of seeking her advice, I was summoned to the president's office and to a meeting with the president and a number of other people where, let's just say it was an unpleasant meeting. He was very upset. I perceived his actions to be threatening. Left that meeting not really, conceding that that was going to be the end of it, which is what he had been seeking to get me to concede during the meeting.
Can I say
yeah.
that having heard the description of it, and I'm not going to put words in your mouth, but I would say, based on what I've heard about that meeting, that it looked like an attempt to intimidate you.
It was an intent to intimidate me. There's no question about it. In fact, at one point, one of the senior administrators in the meeting pretty much had to sort of body block, I think, an attempt by the president to get physical. I mean, he was very upset. Not this institution. Let me just make sure, in case anybody's confused about that. This was a former institution. It was very clearly intimidating and threatening, and there's a record that has pretty much a reconstructed transcript of that meeting. Lasted over an hour until I finally realized it was up to me to call the meeting to a halt, and I pretty much did. During that meeting, by the way, the dean of the law school was summoned in. At which point he repeated his allegation of what had happened in front of the president, and general counsel for the university was there, the provost for the university was there, the chief of staff of the president's office was there. There were about 8 people in the room. Repeated the allegation. He and the president both offered to take lie detector tests, which they never did. But it did sort of raise that allegation to the point that now we had the dean repeating that allegation in front of a number of senior administrators in the room, which again is a pretty powerful allegation. So that probably from the time that I first heard about that remark till that meeting was maybe several weeks, because it took me a while to decide what I was going to do. But the meeting happened within several hours of my having gone to seek the advice of this woman within the administration. And in retrospect, I probably should have been prepared for that sort of reaction. I wasn't. I did not expect that to happen so quickly. And that was on a Friday. And I remember going home that evening and thinking, I need a lawyer. I need a lawyer. I'm not going to be able to navigate this on my own. And that was a really startling moment in my life, because suddenly you realize, you've been kind of used to managing your own life up until then. And now not only was I in a situation where I felt like I needed to hire someone to help me, but it was a situation that involved people that I had worked closely with over a number of years, and involved the institution of which I felt I was really an important part and which meant a lot to me. So it was a really dramatic moment when I realized that I needed to hire a lawyer.
How would you characterize that moment? I mean, I think of it as a time, of course, I've had to hire lawyers before, nothing as dramatic as you have.
Yeah.
I think of it as a time of vulnerability, of not quite helplessness, but enormous vulnerability.
Yeah, no, it was a time of enormous vulnerability when you realize you've got a big problem. It's a problem that threatens your life in some way, and it's a problem that you can't handle on your own. And for somebody, for most of us who've been pretty good at managing our own lives so far, that's really almost an assault on your identity to think, okay, this is a sea change. And I had been telling students for years, the moment somebody hires you, it's a bad moment in their lives, but I didn't really know what that meant until that moment myself. And I remember I didn't know whether I was going to be fired over the weekend. I didn't know what sorts of things were going to happen next.
And of course, one thing that I want the students to realize from that is that being a client makes you a different lawyer. Is that fair?
Yeah, I
Because
think
you
so,
really
yeah.
do experience
Yeah.
what you've been telling them all
Yeah,
along.
oh yeah,
That they come to you at a time of when they really need something.
right.
You needed a lawyer, you needed to pick a lawyer.
Mhm.
You knew a lot of lawyers.
Yeah, I did know a lot of lawyers.
How did you pick the lawyer you picked?
I picked the lawyer I picked because at that moment, my desire was to try to work things out in a, I've already told you I don't really thrive in conflict. I can handle conflict, but I don't enjoy conflict. And, I wanted somebody who could maybe help us work through to some sort of mediated resolution. It seemed to me that there were issues about this search going forward. Number one, we needed to protect that. We didn't need this to blow up publicly because we were in the midst of wanting to hire somebody to be a new dean. I wanted to continue to work at the institution. My husband worked there. These were people I knew. So I hired a lawyer who was practicing in Austin, who had been a former prosecutor, a former very hard-charging litigator. I think he would have described himself earlier in his career as a Rambo kind of litigator. You all may not know that term, but as a very hard-charging litigator, but who had changed his practice in the previous maybe decade, had become certified as a mediator, had become very convinced that often litigation exacerbates disputes instead of helping to resolve them, and I knew he had a real intention around trying to work things out. And so, and I trusted him on a personal level. I'd had him come speak to my classes before. I'd known him through some state bar work, and I think it would be a stretch to say we were friends at that point, but we were, we were acquaintances. We had encountered each other in a number of ways. So I did seek, I think, that meeting happened on a Friday. I think maybe within a few days I was down in Austin in his office talking with him about what happened and what we wanted to do about it.
So you're in a situation where you have a lot of goals. I mean,
Yeah.
you want to protect yourself, and that's I don't mean for that to sound selfish. I mean, you've earned your spot.
Definitely one, yeah.
You want to protect yourself, you want to protect the search, you'd like to protect the university. While you're at it, you'd like to protect the people who are innocent, potential collateral damage
Right.
in all of this. Awful lot of uncertainty. What will they do? What was next on their horizon?
Yeah.
What if?
Yeah, lots of what ifs.
What if?
I didn't have Professor Longan's what if analysis then. I wish I did, but.
So you needed somebody to help you chart a course. You needed somebody to help you be wise.
Right.
You know. How did he do that? What was that relationship like?
He helped me a great deal, and I'm really grateful to him. As you all may know, many people who find themselves in these kinds of situations, and this did end up in litigation several years later, because things kind of went from bad to worse. So we had a long relationship, and he helped me through all of that. And I think he helped me, number one, by really wanting to closely identify my goals. So I can remember at our first meeting in his office, he really wanted me to talk about my goals, my long-term goals, my short-term goals, keep an eye on the big picture. One of the reasons that I had hired him is because I knew his intention to resolution of issues rather than exacerbating issues. I knew, by the way, that he had his own committed faith tradition. It was different from mine, but I knew that he had that, so I felt like there would be space for him to take into the representation values that I was bringing into the representation about what I wanted to do. And that proved to be very true in our relationship. I think he helped me the most, probably in two ways I would identify. One is that he had come to believe during his years as a lawyer that fear accounts for most of the bad things that people do when they're in these situations. And so Mark was very intentional always about identifying what I was afraid of and what we thought others who were involved in this might be afraid of. And that had a way of kind of bringing our deliberation to a point of recognizing the humanity in everybody involved. It made it harder to demonize people when you're talking about what they're afraid of. It made it harder to kind of get on your high horse when you're talking about what you're afraid of. So I think that was something that he did for me that was really helpful, and I've carried that lesson with me since. The other thing that he did was lots of Socratic kind of questioning, and we would be talking about things, and you're in the middle of conflict, you're mad, you feel like you've got right and might on your side, and you want to do something out of that, and he would often get me to focus by asking questions. What's your real motivation here? What do you think is going to happen if you do this? Let's play this out. What are your long-term goals? Where do you want to be in 6 months? Where do you want to be in 2 years? And I remember he said to me one time, I was really caught up and angry and wanted him to do something kind of explosive, and he said, we can do that. And I will do that. But I want to remind you that you told me earlier this is where you want to end up. And he said, I don't think you'll be happy in a few months if you look back and see that this is what we've done. And having him being willing to challenge me in those situations, I think, was really helpful, because he had to bring that big picture that I wasn't capable of doing for myself in the midst of emotion, conflict, anger, fear, all of those things. Expectations, once this became public, and it took about a year for it to become public, but once it did, then a lot of people were involved and had expectations. So I'm very grateful to have had a lawyer who could guide me in that way.
A couple of things I find interesting about your description, Ed. First of all, he made no assumptions about what your real goals were.
No, he didn't.
He didn't.
Yeah.
And we do classroom exercises, you have to make some assumptions about these people on a piece of paper, but with real human beings, you have to ask.
Yeah.
Right. And he took the time to find out.
Yeah, he did.
And didn't direct you.
No, he didn't direct me, although he certainly would offer what he thought I ought to be thinking about. So, in that sense, he didn't just leave it up to me. But no, he was a really effective listener and questioner. And I know he got tired of doing that, probably because that's time consuming. He had a busy practice, you're in a hurry, and it's like, oh, I've got to listen to this woman again, prod her to talk over and over again. And when you're going through something like that, boy, you really want to vent, and your lawyer is the safe place to vent, right? So that's another thing that I learned about being a client. Well, boy, the lawyers get it all. It just kind of gets dumped on the lawyer. And he was very good about that. And sometimes he'd say, okay, you're venting now, and that's kind of expensive for both of us, so maybe we ought to move on. He was able to challenge me in that way. We had that kind of relationship where we could do that.
But he offered you his advice.
He did absolutely offer advice. And I hired him for his expertise, because he had expertise that I didn't have, which is what I needed.
I want to ask you about a particular moment in this process.
Okay.
And this is the moment when you see a piece of paper that says your name, plaintiff, and the institution you have served for all these years as defendant.
Yeah.
What was that like?
That was, I recall that moment quite clearly. And I told you it took a while, so let me give a little bit of background. One of the things that happened after this meeting with the president and I met with the lawyer is that I decided that I should share what I knew with the search committee, because this was really a problem for the search committee about how to go forward. I decided a means for doing that. We had a search committee meeting coming up. I talked to the chair of the committee. I asked to be on the agenda. He knew what was going to be on the agenda. University General Counsel knew that I'd ask about this, knew that I planned to speak. After some drama, the meeting went forward. I spoke to the committee. The committee actually responded really well, and for a moment we thought that we had a process in place that was going to protect applicants, protect the university. We were satisfied with that. We thought maybe that was going to be the end. It was not the end. It was not the end in part because then those in Section 4 will know why I'm referencing this, because then a clerical error emerged in my paycheck that lasted for a good while. And so that was one of the retaliatory sorts of things that ended up being alleged. But I tell you all this to give you this sequence of events, because for about a year, this was completely private. Very few people knew. The search committee knew, a couple of close friends knew, the people who had been involved in it knew. So my lawyer and I were kind of working behind the scenes on all of this, trying to work things out. There came a moment when if I didn't file an EEOC complaint, I was going to give up some rights, and because there was this salary issue going on, we filed an EEOC complaint. Well, of course, that's public record. And so almost a year after the events began, an enterprising reporter for the university newspaper asked the university to disclose any EEOC filings that had been made against them, and mine was among those. And so he ran a very extensive story in the university paper, and that's the point at which it became public. That changed the dynamics dramatically, changed what I needed from my lawyer dramatically, because now your lawyer is your public spokesperson for you. I found that hard. I have a few control issues, you know. I don't really like somebody else out there speaking for me, and so that was a new thing for me to experience as a client. By the way, just so you all will know, one of the things that happened after it became public was a student march on the president's office. I mean, this whole thing is kind of dramatic, but student march on the president's office. President ended up leaving, which was good. We thought things were getting better. It turns out they didn't get better. They continued to get worse for a variety of reasons that don't matter. And so, really, about a year and a half to 2 years after it first happened is when I filed the lawsuit. So it was quite a journey to get from this initial meeting to determining to file a lawsuit. And some of the reason to file a lawsuit was frustration, feeling like that was the only thing that was going to help get things better. So my lawyer and I have been working together on drafting this complaint, sending documents back and forth to each other. And then I remember the final document rolled off my printer. And that's the moment that you're talking about, where there's my name, you know, versus my institution. And again, it made me realize what litigants go through in this process, because my lawyer's name was on that document. His name was at the end of the document, a multi-page document, right? It was not right up front. My name was up there all by itself on that side of the V. And I've talked about this some too, that, you know, I had never, up until that moment in my life, felt like I had enemies in the world, and all of a sudden it was like, there it was in black and white, you know, when you've got that V between your name and other people's names, that means that you're in an adversarial relationship that's official, that's public, that's known. You know, parties are drawing up sides to kind of go after each other, and that was a really momentous realization for me. Yeah, that sticks in my mind really clearly.
Litigation is stressful for the client. I think that's clear. If you could talk a little bit about what it was like to be a client during the litigation, and then I want you to talk about the decision that eventually came along to drop the case.
Being a client during the litigation was hard, because now all of a sudden a lot more people are involved, either officially or unofficially. It becomes public. People feel pressure to you know, take up sides. There are expectations around you. You know, you're going to be the one that's finally going to clean this place up, which we know a simple lawsuit probably can't do that. People have expectations around what the law is going to be able to do for you that are not realistic. Parties have a lot of tools at their disposal to make life difficult for the other party. The university spared no expense. When my deposition was taken, there were 5 lawyers at the table: University General Counsel, private counsel from a major law firm in Houston, the Attorney General's office had representation there. And you suddenly realize, you know, what you've taken on. Now, I was the plaintiff, so I did this voluntarily. Nobody did that to me, and I certainly had my eyes open going in. But it's different to think you understand it and then understand it. Discovery is like just opening up your life to the world. So, you know, not only are they deposing me, they're deposing my friends, my colleagues. They want emails. You all know they're entitled to emails in which there's been discussion of any of this event. Well, you can imagine over the course of 2+ years in an emotional event like that, there were a lot of emails that people had sent me that they did not expect at some point would be turned over to lawyers. So it was really difficult. And I think workplace disputes are a little bit like family law disputes, in that it does pull a lot of people in. And one of the things that happens often in these kinds of disputes is that, you know, the visible pressure on the plaintiff or the person who's spoken up is calculated in part for its effect on other people who are watching, and that is to control the behavior of other people who were in the workplace as well. And so there were people who would go to lunch with me, but we couldn't leave the law school together to go to lunch. We had to meet at lunch, right? Because they didn't want to be seen going to lunch with me. Or people I had been friends with who suddenly, didn't want to talk to me or whatever. And I understood some of that. There were some people who stuck with me really, heroically almost at some real expense to their own careers. There were others who, for whatever reason, didn't or couldn't make that choice. And so it was hard. And you're conscious of the fact that you're kind of bringing this down on your workplace. Trust me, you don't really want to be in that situation. And yet, I felt from the beginning that my only other choice was to not be truthful about what I knew. And I just could never, I could never get to the point where I didn't think I could be truthful about what I knew. This had landed in my lap. It was wrong, and I felt like I had to, speak up.
And you did, and then you decided eventually to drop the case. Talk just a minute about that.
Yeah. Well, I decided to drop the case after I got hired at Mercer. So while all of this was going on, I decided to get into dean searches. That was probably in retrospect. I can't imagine why I thought that would be successful, but thankfully it was. I will say that one of my damages claims was harm to my future administrative career because, as you all can imagine, there are a lot of bad things that get said about you when you're in that kind of situation. I decided both. My son had graduated from high school. We were freer to move. It would have been the next step even without this in my career. Clearly, I was looking maybe to make an institutional change, and I thought, well, I'm going to go ahead and pursue this. So I had applied to several schools, had the interview at Mercer. Mercer was willing to look at everything that had happened in that lawsuit. I don't think it was the conversation with you where I talked about the lawsuit, that first conversation, but the first conversation with the representative of the search firm who was handling the search, we talked about it. Anyway, I got hired at Mercer, even though I was a plaintiff in a discrimination case against my then institution. Presidents make decisions about who's going to be dean. I was a plaintiff in a case alleging that the president had done something wrongful. So Dr. Kirby Godsey, who was president then at Mercer, was willing to look at that and I don't think that detracts from what we want in a dean. So I got hired here to be dean and then had a decision to make about how I wanted to spend the next few years of my life. And I decided that I was ready to move on, that I wanted to devote my full time and attention to Mercer, and so I voluntarily dismissed the lawsuit. Yeah.
And I know some people thought you should, back in Texas, thought you shouldn't do that.
Yeah.
And I won't pretend to a cause and effect here, but I do want to note that the dean of the Texas Tech Law School is a woman now.
That's true. Yeah. Yeah. That's true.
Normally at this point, I would invite you to offer advice to the students. But I think what I would rather do is make sure I've got time in case they have questions for you. So why don't we do that, and then if we have time, I'll give you my advice question,
Okay.
but I want to make sure
Okay.
they have a chance
Okay.
to ask you questions.
Great.
So, what
What's on
questions do
your
you
mind?
have for our dean about being a client?
Or anything.
I have a question. When you have a great pedagogic interest in what makes attorneys and how they form their ideals in law schools, and how law schools as an institution really start to cultivate their knowledge. And that's a very epistemological understanding of law. And I'm wondering where you got that introduction to. What really
Yeah.
piqued your interest in that very unique area of law?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. Two things I think piqued my interest. One was becoming Associate Dean for Academic Affairs, where I saw the institution from a different perspective than I had from just being a classroom teacher. And part of the job at that institution, it overlapped very closely with the Dean of Students role, and I was dealing with a lot of students who were having difficulty in law school, and I began to see that there was something maybe systematic happening that was causing some of these problems that I was seeing or challenges that I was seeing. And about that time, I also had the opportunity to get involved with the Carnegie Foundation's research on legal education, and so I took that interest and was able to explore it through their support, and that started that journey. You know, probably, it's pretty clear too that my own experience of being an unhappy law student informed that as well, but I think it took that experience of being an associate dean to tie those threads together.
What else?
Lots of questions.
Bobby.
I know, big surprise. Thank you for sharing a very personal story. It sounds a lot like some of the hypotheticals that we run into about, we have an administrator or a senior partner at a firm, and what do you do, the what ifs.
What a coincidence.
I know, right?
Yeah.
I know, right?
That's true, yeah.
This is like my insightful analysis there. One of the questions that we're always asked in our discussion groups are, so what if you'd done something differently?
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
I'm sure you've talked a lot about it with not just your family, but thought about it.
Yeah.
Would you have gone to that female provost official? Would you have addressed the president himself personally?
Yeah.
What would you have done differently if you could do it all over again?
Yeah, it's so interesting that you asked that question because I actually don't think about it a whole lot anymore,
Oh, really?
but in the immediate aftermath, I spent a lot of time thinking about those questions, and while you're in it, you think about that. Well, what if I'd done this, or what if I'd done that? I think it's very useful to ask yourself those questions ahead of time, the what ifs, and play it out. I think it can be useful up to a point to ask yourself those questions afterwards, but there's always some unknown, and where I've finally ended up is to say, you know what, I tried to make the best judgments I could under the circumstances. I don't think every decision I made was probably the right one, but I tried to have good people around me helping me make those decisions. I tried to be as self-aware as I could, and so looking back, I've tried not to think too much about whether I would have gone in different directions. I think it's clear I made some mistakes, but I think that's going to be inevitable. When you're acting in this environment of inherent uncertainty, it's hard. But I did try to look ahead, and that's one thing that the lawyer did for me. You need somebody who's objective, and when you're in that situation, my husband was very much involved, and he was a good counselor. I had some good friends and colleagues who were, but they were all invested in the situation in a way that the lawyer was not. He cared, but he had objectivity that none of us had. And so it's one of the things that I counted on the lawyer to do, is to help me run those what ifs in a way that down the road we wouldn't have regrets. And sometimes he would say that to me, Daisy, if we go in this direction, I think you're going to regret it. And that was helpful. I don't know if that really answers your question. That's what comes to mind.
Yes, ma'am, right here.
What do you think would have happened if you had not voluntarily dismissed the case?
It was just for purposes of the recording.
Yeah.
Question is, what do you think would have happened if you had not dropped the case?
I think it would have been a long, protracted, and ugly process that would have been hard on me and my family, distracting to my job here. I think we probably would have ended up settling. I don't know that we would have gone to trial. I think we had a good enough case that we might have gotten some recovery. That part of the difficulty with the case legally was that as a tenured member of the law faculty, I had not been fired. It would be very difficult to fire me. So my damages were not at the same level as many plaintiffs are when they're filing these kind of workplace discrimination lawsuits. And because one of my major elements of damages was harm to my future career, and Mercer had just disproved that element.
You're welcome.
Yes, thankfully, that's what you want. We really, probably the legal aspects were lessened somewhat by my coming to Mercer. So that was part of the calculation, but also knowing that, litigation gives people tools to be very destructive of each other. And I think it would have gone on that way for a while, and I just wasn't willing to do that anymore. Part of my motivation had been to try to change the institution I was a part of, and I struggled with this decision at the time, but I was now going to be part of a new institution, and I kind of had to leave that struggle to those who were still at the institution. So, who knows what would have happened, but I think it would have been difficult.
Yes, sir.
Having done practice, education, and administration, are there any other parts of the legal world that you would like to participate in? Or
That's a
maybe
good
wish you had?
question. No, I did have a little foray into the possibility of a judicial appointment a couple of years ago, and was willing to look into that and be considered for that because of my respect for the judiciary and the importance of that work, and a feeling that I thought that might be a place where I could contribute. I think probably that impulse and opportunity have passed, so I don't see myself pursuing that. No, I'm really happy being a law professor the rest of my life. So.
And I'll tell you, because she won't. The Obama administration was considering her for appointment to the 11th Circuit. So that's what that was. So. Is there another question over here? Yes, sir.
Yeah. It seems like in a lot of our hypos, doing the right thing just for the sake of doing the right thing has a lot of personal consequences. So was it worth it?
Great question. And
Yeah,
again, I want the recording
yeah,
to reflect
okay.
it. I mean, doing the right thing because it's the right thing has personal
Yeah.
consequences, and the question is, was it worth it?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question, and I've pondered that question because at some point, I mean, I was motivated by lots of things, and it's easy to say you're motivated by wanting to help the institution and do all this, but there was this part of me that was just like, this is the right thing to do, and by God, I'm going to do it no matter what it takes, and that's a dangerous impulse. You have to be aware of that. But yes, I do think it was worth it in the sense that it felt all along like a choice of whether to abide by personal integrity or not. And I just don't think you can give away your integrity and live with that well, I've been really fortunate that decision has been borne out by the fact that, I did have an institution that was willing to look at it and end up saying to me, as Mercer did, we kind of like what this has to say about you rather than it being a negative. So I'm really fortunate. Not everybody who gets in that situation is that fortunate, but I do want you to take that lesson away that at the beginning of all of this, there were people, including my dean, who said, do not do this, you're going to ruin your career. You're going to ruin your career. And maybe it was foolishness on my part or just an understanding that I couldn't live with myself if I just was silent and watched this happen, that had me go forward. But fortunately, it didn't ruin my career. And in fact, I think I learned a lot through that process that made me come out better on the other end. And I credit my lawyer with that. He allowed me to make decisions that were consistent with my integrity and allowed me to be better at the end than I was at the beginning. I don't think that would have happened in the hands of another, of every other lawyer. I think there were other lawyers who could have done it, but I think he was key to that. So yes, I think it was worth it. I'll have to say I also felt like, I stand up, I tell my children, this is the way you ought to live your lives. I've been telling my students, this is the way you ought to live your lives. So I thought, well, if you're not willing to do this, you better just shut up about that, right? And stop telling other people that they should do this, and stop telling people you should do things that are hard unless you can. And when it became public, and my students learned what had happened, that was a moment for me when I thought, okay, I'm glad I'm not embarrassed by what they've learned. And I will just have to tell you, those students kept me going for that 6 months or so after it became public, because that was a very difficult period in my life. And students were unbelievable.
Daisy, I know the students have more questions, but you're handy. So if they want to ask you
Oh, yeah,
questions.
yeah, I was going to say, no, I'm not handy, but yeah, I'm available. That's what you mean.
On the second
that is
floor.
not one of my talents, to be handy, but I am available anytime.
And I know you have a class to teach.
I do have a class to teach.
so-
Although I don't mind sticking around. If I'm a little late to class, you all wait for me. But and I will say, Professor Longan was leaving it up to me whether to bring this up. But in one of these pieces, one of the ways I've dealt with this is I've tried several times to write about this experience. Have not published any of them, but I shared these with Professor Longan, and one of them had some lessons learned embedded, and he has printed out lessons learned. We've talked about many of those, but if you're interested in looking at those, they're available for you. Don't feel that you have to take them. But thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Daisy.